I would love for you to just fill us in on what has happened in the years since.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry that the credits didn't get to the end, but at the end we have credits that talk about, what we've done since this case. This is one of my earlier cases that I started working on in the 1980s, and Walter was the first person who we were able to win freedom for after proving his innocence. Since that time, we've now actually won release or relief or reversals for 140 wrongly convicted death row prisoners. And which you may not have seen, I don't know where exactly the film stopped, but Anthony Ray Hinton in the film, who's played by O'Shea Jackson, he's the third prisoner on death row. I wasn't working on his case at the time that I worked on Walter's case, but in 1999 I took on his case as well, and we fought for about 16 years, and I actually took the case to the United States Supreme Court, and we got a reversal, and in 2015 we won his freedom. He was released from death row after we were able to prove his innocence.
Yes.
Yeah. And wonderfully, he now works at EJI. He is actually one of our community educators, and so he goes out and talks to people about his experience. And we've had really important developments. One of the things that didn't happen was much change in that community, and we have a little update at the end of the film that talks about the fact that the sheriff, Tom Tate, who was responsible for putting Mr. McMillan on death row and Ralph Myers on death row, was actually reelected sheriff 6 times. And he just retired this year. And there wasn't really much change. We filed a civil suit to get damages for Walter. And we were able to get some, but there's immunity law in this country, so that police and prosecutors and judges are actually shielded from accountability. And it's one of the areas where I think there's a desperate need for reform, because people aren't motivated to do better when they're so protected from any accountability. Ralph Myers, the man who testifies ultimately and tells the truth, was released last year. We're actually working with him now in reentry. And the work continues. My work has continued. I actually just argued a case at the Supreme Court last term that extended protections for people who have mental illness, dementia. So you saw in the Herbert Richardson case, had we had that ruling, 30 years ago, we might have been able to stop his execution. But that's been a continued focus, is to help people who are vulnerable in our jails and prisons, and certainly people on death row.
It's hard to describe that scene, the execution scene of Herbert. I was listening, and I don't think that there was a dry eye in the house during that scene. Were there any parts of this story? I mean, this is Walter's story, this is Herbert's story, but this is also your story. This is based on your memoir, and it's a very personal story. Were there any parts of this that were difficult for you to relive through this medium?
I think it was just not difficult, but it was I was anxious about whether the humanity and the dignity of my clients would be visible, because that's the thing that mattered most to me. I mean, these are real people. This is not made up. On the night of that execution of Herbert Richardson, which was the first time I'd actually worked on a case where we weren't able to get a stay, it was really challenging. And he had this kind of dignity that was so moving. And just as you saw in the film, when I got to the row, he was telling me about his day, and he just kept saying how strange the day had been, because when he woke up, the guards came to him and said, "What do you want for breakfast?" And at midday, they said, "What do you want for lunch?" And in the evening, they said, "What do you want for dinner?" And he kept saying, "Bryan, it's been so strange. All day long, people have been saying, 'What can I do to help you? Can we get you stamps to mail your letters? Can we get you coffee? Can we get you access to the phone?" And we were back there, and we were talking and praying. And then he said, "Bryan, it's been so strange." He said, "More people have said, 'What can I do to help you?' in the last 14 hours of my life than they ever did in the first 19 years of my life." And the whole time we were having that conversation, I was thinking about, where were they when you were 3 and your mom died? And where were they when you were 7 and you were being abused? And where were they when you were struggling as a teenager? Where were they when you came back from Vietnam traumatized and disabled? And I just wanted the pain of the moment, but also the power of the moment to come through. And that's where I'm so grateful to these amazing actors. Rob Morgan, who plays Herbert, does an amazing job, an incredible performance. And that was true for everybody. And I think that was my biggest anxiety. I didn't want any of the people that I know and I fought for and that I love and care about to be presented as one-dimensional, as not fully human. And I was just relieved when I saw that humanity on display.
Well, something that struck me, and I can't believe I've never thought about it before today, Herbert talks about how most of us, we don't know when we're going to die.
Right.
But he has all that time, and all these people that you have worked with have this time to think about how they're going to die, when they're going to die. That was just such a heavy realization for me. And you have this incredible gift of helping people like Herbert feel seen when he hadn't felt seen his entire life. But I know that, as you mentioned, you had some hesitation about your story being seen in this way, being realized from a memoir to a film. What was it about the partnership of Destin Daniel Cretton, the director, and Michael B. Jordan that really brought you peace?
Yeah, I mean, I just, my career, I've always said that I want to be a lawyer who's client-centered. It's really about the clients. It's about their story. It's getting people to pay attention to the pain and anguish that they have to live through when you're wrongly convicted or unfairly sentenced. And, I was always hesitant to in any way distract from that. But I think about 12 years ago, I realized that we weren't going to be able to do all the things we wanted to do if we stayed in the courts. I'm a product of Brown versus Board of Education. I grew up in a community where black children couldn't go to the public schools. I actually started my education in a colored school. And lawyers came into our community and made them open up the public schools, and that's how I got to go to high school. There were no high schools for black kids in my county when my dad was a teenager, so he couldn't go to high school in that county. And the lawyers came in, and I was always intrigued by the power these lawyers had to protect the rights of disfavored people, disenfranchised people. We grew up poor, we grew up isolated, we grew up marginalized in many ways. And so I wanted to use that power on behalf of people who were in jails and prisons. But about 12 years ago, I started thinking about my own opportunities as a result of Brown, and I began to fear that we probably couldn't win Brown versus Board of Education today. I don't think our courts today would do anything that disruptive on behalf of a disempowered, disfavored, disenfranchised group of people. And that made me really worry. And so I felt like we had to start talking about why this commitment to equality and fairness and justice is important, because I think people had lost the answer to that question about why it matters. And we decided to just get more visible and more vocal. I gave a TED Talk, I wrote the book. We started doing reports about the history of racial inequality. That's the other part of the story that I think was important. I don't think we're free in this country. I think we're burdened by our history of racial injustice, and we haven't talked about these critical issues that are so relevant. And so all of that happened. And so when the movie opportunity came along, I was hesitant because I didn't, I know I'm at a film kind of festival, but Hollywood gets it wrong a lot when they tell these kinds of stories. And I was worried about a kind of a Hollywood treatment of this story. And what made me comfortable was Michael B., who was so committed to doing this the right way, and Destin, and the team that got put together. They were so sincere, and they spent time with me, and that gave me the confidence that we could make this work. And then Destin was very solicitous of my input, and was able to kind of play a role in shaping the script and the storytelling. And when I saw the film for the first time, I was actually really pleased with it. And we can do things with movies that you can't. A lot of people will see a movie that won't read a book, and so you can't take away these opportunities. You can't ignore these platforms and what they represent. And I do think narrative work right now is urgent. I think that if we don't change some of the narratives that have sustained these problems, we're going to see these problems for a very long time. You know, we have mass incarceration because 40, 50 years ago, we declared this misguided war on drugs. We said that people who are drug dependent and drug addicted are criminals, and we need the criminal justice system to respond to that population. We didn't have to say that. We could have said that people with addiction and dependency have a health problem, and we need our healthcare system to respond. And the reason why I think we made the criminal justice choice was because we were being governed by the politics of fear and anger. Our politicians were preaching fear and anger. Everybody wanted to be tough on crime. It was both parties. And that narrative led us to accept things we should never accept, to tolerate things we should never tolerate. And I actually think that fear and anger are the essential ingredients of injustice and oppression and abuse. They convicted Walter McMillian because of that narrative of fear and anger. And we have to do narrative work to disrupt that. We actually have to push back against those mindsets, those sentiments. And we're in this moment today where there's a lot of fear and anger being preached by elected officials and all across the world. It's a threat to justice. And so narrative work like this has become really important to me, and that's why I'm really excited to see the film get out there.
Well, speaking of fear and anger, it's hard not to watch a film like this and feel those emotions.
Yeah.
Just when you think about the details of Walter McMillian's case, it's just disgusting how this happened. It's hard to even fathom. And I wonder, you've seen so much of this throughout your career. How are you not consumed by rage? How do you find hope? Because I'm sure there are some of you sitting in the audience who are consumed by rage right now.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, it is kind of an orientation. It's just sort of a philosophy. I just think to do justice, to change the world, you have to stay hopeful. In fact, I actually think that hopelessness is the enemy of justice. Injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. When we actually accept what we see and can't imagine that we can create something better, we've become sort of part of the problem. I think you're either hopeful or you're the problem because there's no real neutral ground. And the thing that affirms that for me, that allows me to hold on to that, is that I'm a product of someone's hope, right? I live in Montgomery, Alabama. I've been working there for 35 years. I'm not unmindful about the people who were doing the work I'm doing today 60 years ago. People who had to frequently say, my head is bloodied but not bowed. I've never had to say that. I'm standing on the shoulders of people who did so much more with so much less that I feel like I am required to stay hopeful. I never met a lawyer until I got to Harvard Law School, and I had to believe I could be something I'd never seen. My great-grandparents were enslaved. My great-grandfather was enslaved in Virginia, but learned to read as an enslaved person, even though it could have cost him his life or could have caused him to be sold. And my grandmother would tell me these stories about how when emancipation came, everybody would come over to their house, and every night he would read the newspaper to the entire community, and she would sit next to him because she was so proud of the fact that he could read, and he taught her to read even though there were no schools, and that was an act of hope. And she taught my mother to read, and that was an act of hope. And we were poor, but my mother went in debt to buy the World Book encyclopedias. We had those books in our house, even sometimes when we didn't have water and a whole host of other things that we wanted, but we had those. And that was an act of hope. And today, I do this work, and I feel pushed by all of the hope that made it possible for me to be here. My office is on this street called Commerce Street in Montgomery, and it's the thoroughfare where thousands of enslaved people were trafficked during the mid-19th century history. And they have a scene of the river. That's actually the actual Alabama River. It's right down the street from my office, and sometimes I go down there and I think about that. And there are times when I feel like when I'm sitting there that I can hear the anguish of all of those enslaved people who were trafficked and all of that suffering that took place during lynching and all of the humiliation that took place during segregation. And when you go into a jail or prison or on death row, sometimes you hear the sounds of anguish from people in these spaces, and these sounds can haunt you. But there are times when I go down to that river and I'm feeling a little low, and I will hear those sounds and they'll begin to shift. And all of a sudden, it'll sound like the enslaved and the lynched and the segregated and the incarcerated. And what they're saying is, you keep fighting. I really do feel sustained by the force of so many people who have been fighting for freedom and fighting for justice and fighting for change. And knowing that I am standing on their shoulders and that they are pushing me forward, I have no choice but to be hopeful and to keep fighting. And that's the beautiful thing about doing justice work. If you give it your all, if you just fight and do everything you can, beautiful things will come back to you. They will. And I was just last week, we've opened a museum and memorial in Montgomery, and it's been really transformative to have so many people come. And I was going into a little sandwich shop, and there was a group of 3 older black women. They were sitting at a table, and I had my little tray, and I was walking over to a table, and one of the older women saw me, and she said, hey, you put your tray down, you come back over here. So I said, okay, and I put my tray down, and I walked back over, and she said, lean over. And I leaned over, and when I leaned over, she reached up, and she kissed me on the forehead. She said, now, you keep on keeping on. You're doing some good stuff. Now, go back there and eat your food. And, I meet sort of sweet, precious people like that, but that moved me, and it's people like that that encourage and affirm you, that make you feel like you can keep fighting.
I already feel more hopeful. I feel the hope now. Can we get a round of applause for hope, people? Woo!
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for that, Bryan. We cannot have this conversation without acknowledging the one person who I really wish could be here.
Yeah.
And that's Walter.
Yeah.
And I know that you two became pretty close in the years after his exoneration and before his death. What do you think he would say if he saw the film?
Well, I think, thinking about hope, I think he would just be so moved that people are sitting in an auditorium in Los Angeles, California, learning about what happened. And when he got out, he was really, really desperate for people to know what happened to him. And he just felt like, he would say, I didn't imagine this could happen until it happened to me. And I feel this kind of burden to make sure other people know why we have to change our system. And we were very close. When he got out, he tried to go back to working as a logger, and he unfortunately had an accident where he ended up with his neck being broken. And he recovered from that, but he came and he lived with me for a while, and he did some other work. But eventually the stress of being on the row really undermined his health, and he had early onset dementia and really struggled. So he wasn't able to go out and do the education that he wanted to, and that's why I know he'd be so thrilled, so proud, so excited that people are learning his story. We screened this for his family a few weeks ago, and they were so moved and excited. Because that's what happens when you live in the margins. You can sometimes feel like you're invisible, like your grief doesn't matter, like your suffering doesn't matter, that the burdens that you have to live through don't matter. And I think when you can give voice to it, it really is powerful. And I have that same sense. I have to go into places where I'm still presumed dangerous and guilty. In fact, I argued a case at the Supreme Court a few years ago. And then I had a hearing in this court in the Midwest, and I had my suit and tie on. I went to the courtroom to do the hearing, and I was at defense counsel's table. And when the judge saw me sitting there, he got angry. And he said, hey, you get back out there in the hallway. You wait until your lawyer gets here. I don't want any defendant sitting in my courtroom without their lawyer. And
no,
I had to,
he did.
I had to stand up and apologize. And I had to say, I'm sorry, Your Honor, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Bryan Stevenson. I am the lawyer. And the judge started laughing, and the prosecutor started laughing. I made myself laugh because I didn't want to disadvantage my client. My client came in, we did the hearing, but afterward, I was thinking, what is it when this judge saw a middle-aged black man in a suit and tie sitting at defense counsel's table? It didn't even occur to him that's the lawyer. And what that is this narrative of racial difference, this presumption of guilt and dangerousness that we assign to black and brown people. And as I get older, I can tell you, when you have to constantly navigate these presumptions, it's exhausting. You get tired. And that's why I think it's so important that we find ways to give voice to what that struggle is about, what the weight feels like. And I know that Walter is rejoicing that his story is getting told, and that more and more people will understand what happened to him, and hopefully be committed to making sure that it doesn't happen to others.
And how about that resemblance with Jamie Foxx? I know you said that was one of the first things that struck you when you saw the film.
Yeah. Well, Jamie's performance is absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
And the thing that I guess I wasn't prepared for, because I wasn't on set when they were shooting those early scenes, was how much he does look exactly like Walter. That picture at the beginning where he has the hat and the bushy hair, that is exactly what Walter looks like. We have some photos in our office, and it was uncanny, and even the family had that response. And so I did feel like that was Walter on screen, and I think that's the beautiful thing about storytelling and about films. They can be really powerful tools to get people to understand the lives of others, and I really do hope people think more critically about what we're doing. The other statistic that we put up at the end of the film that you didn't see is that we've now proved innocent 166 people on death row. And that essentially means that for every 9 people we've executed in this country, we've identified one innocent person on death row. It's a shocking rate of error. And yet, you know, we're still trying to execute people. There's a man named Rodney Reed in Texas who is also, I think, innocent, who's facing execution next Wednesday. And we're very worried that he could be executed. And, you know, I just think it's painful because, you know, if somebody said, you know, 1 out of every 9 apples sold in the grocery store has a toxin that if you touch it, it will kill you instantly, nobody would sell apples. We wouldn't do that. We wouldn't tolerate a rate of error like that. But we're permitting this death penalty to continue when we know, based on the data, that we're making a lot of mistakes. And I think that tragedy has to be challenged, but it won't be challenged until we get closer to the lives of people who have lived through that trauma. And I hope the film contributes to that.
Yeah, and thankfully, like films like this help us get closer.
Yeah.
For those of us who don't have the kind of access that you have had throughout your life and career. It has been an interesting evening, right? Unfortunately, we didn't get to see the final few minutes of the film, so I would love to open it up to just maybe 2 questions. Hand there, shot up.
Yeah, that's a great question. Part of the reason why I did the 60 Minutes thing was actually to create a narrative about his innocence that could be transmitted directly to people in the community, because I was very worried about that. As you saw, I got death threats and bomb threats when I was working on this case, and I was very worried about his security. And the 60 Minutes thing didn't really help us with the litigation, and in fact, the court was not particularly happy that that happened. But it was very helpful in getting people in the community to ask some questions about his guilt and to kind of have a different narrative about that. And when he first got out, he did not go back to Monroeville. I was really nervous about that. He spent time in some other places, but eventually he was able to go back there, and he didn't have really any serious challenges. By the time he got back, you know, the law enforcement officers, not the sheriff and the people you saw in this film, but the ABI, the Alabama Bureau of Investigation, had intervened and had pretty much said he's innocent and we're actually looking at somebody else. That was the other fact point we put up. The person who likely committed this crime was a white man who was seen running from the crime scene shortly after the shooting took place. They never prosecuted him. They never convicted him because they couldn't get cooperation from the local sheriff. But that helped, I think, make it easier for him to get back into the community. And he was able to live the rest of his life in Monroe County. These prisons are not accessible to a lot of people. There's no transparency, and it's like this whole other world. And many guards are taught that the prisoners are the enemy, and that people who try to help the enemy are also suspect. And that dynamic does have to be challenged. I do think when people spend enough time in proximity to other folks, it gets harder for them to hold on to this idea that the incarcerated are the enemy or somehow evil or something fundamentally different. But the culture change that I think we need has to start with our holding these institutions accountable. I mean, it's just simply wrong that people who want to help incarcerated people get to a place where they don't return to jails or prisons are treated like they're doing something wrong, like they're bad people. That's a leadership issue. That's the kind of the culture that we have to change. I do see remarkable change in some of the places where I work. Actually in the book I talk about the guard who treated me so badly, who has an even more radical transformation than what we present in the film. I think people want to get to a healthier place. They want to be fair. They want to be just. But we create conditions and structures that are designed to make sure that that fairness and justice is really hard to achieve. And so I think we have to change that. I am worried about our conditions of confinement right now. Our prisons are overcrowded. They're violent. We've made it harder for people to challenge unconstitutional conditions of confinement. I urge everybody, if you have an opportunity, to do volunteer work, to actually go into jails and prisons. It's an absolutely critically important thing to do. And then talk to your elected officials about holding institutions accountable when they're acting poorly, when they're not treating people fairly. I do think we have to create more accountability in our system. And one of the things I ask people, if I had my way, there'd be all of these questions at the end of the movie. They're not. But if I had my way, one of the questions would be, do you know who your district attorney is? Because if you don't know who your district attorney is, then you don't actually know what they're doing to respond to these kinds of problems. Does your county have a conviction integrity unit, which are units that some prosecutors have set up to respond to assertions of innocence? Because the prosecutor is much better empowered to respond to these problems than anybody else. And then we can start demanding that our local prosecutors and our local communities have those kinds of systems. That would have saved Walter McMillan from the very beginning. Anthony Ray Hinton wouldn't have been on death row for 30 years. And the same is true for jails and prisons. Are we facilitating volunteer programs that help prisoners get their GED, that help people deal with addiction and dependency problems, that help people set up reentry plans when they leave? And if we don't have that, we need to demand that. And when we do that, we'll begin to see some of that stuff shift.
Time for one more right here.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, you're absolutely.
And may I add to that a little bit?
Yeah.
It is so hard for us to talk about race
Sure.
right now because it is, it just feels like such a volatile topic of conversation. Give us some tips. How do we have these conversations in our social circles?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the question because I really do think that we can do more and we have to do more. And I hope that's what people will take from this film. One of the things that we'll have go live, the film will open on Christmas, we have on our website, eji.org, a whole set of action items. It will have opportunities for people to get involved. We'll be able to connect people to local organizations that are working with people coming out of jails and prisons, and so people can volunteer with those organizations. We'll have campaigns listed, like this execution of Rodney Reed in Texas would be something that you'd find there. But we'll also have some really practical things that people can do in terms of how to educate. We have materials at EJI. We have a calendar that talks about our history of racial injustice, and we offer it to people. And each day it has something on there that most people don't know anything about. And we're encouraging people to use that and to get their schools to use it. We have a curriculum we're developing that talks about the Native genocide, the genocide of Native people when Europeans came to this continent, that talks about slavery through a different lens, that talks about lynching, that talks about segregation, that talks about the problems of mass incarceration. And we really want to empower people who are motivated to have these tools and use these tools to engage people. There's a documentary that actually did earlier this year that premiered at the AFI Festival that we encourage people to get. It'll actually be online in January, accessible to anybody, and a lot of people are doing screenings of that and then having conversations about race because it's directly there. And then the last thing I'm going to urge people to do is to come to Montgomery. We've opened this museum. We've opened this memorial. It is really a space dedicated to facilitating discourse about our history of racial injustice. It's about what slavery did and how it evolved and became terrorism and lynching and how it evolved and became segregation and how it's evolved to become the problems of police violence and over-incarceration that we see today. And we have projects where we're asking communities to put up markers at every lynching site in America. We're asking communities to engage in what we call community remembrance. And we will offer support and services and materials to anybody who wants to lead that effort in their community. And I really appreciate your question, because I do hope people will not just watch the movie and then forget about it, but will watch the movie and look for ways to now get engaged and involved in responding to this problem. You're welcome. Thank you.
I think that is a beautiful way to end. I love ending on a call to action. Bryan, I love your heart. I aspire to have a heart like yours, and I think our world would be a better place if we all had a heart half as big as yours. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.